The planet loomed beneath them, a dark, desolate sphere orbiting a dying sun. The light from the star was weak and anemic, casting a pale, sickly glow across the surface, like the last flicker of a candle about to be snuffed out. As the Endeavour began its descent, the exploration team peered out from the small, reinforced windows, staring at the twisted, barren landscape that stretched endlessly below. There was nothing inviting about it, just jagged mountains, deep yawning chasms, and a sea of blackened rock that seemed to shift and writhe, almost as if it were alive. Captain Hale gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white as the ship shuddered violently. It wasn't the turbulence that worried him. The Endeavour had been through worse, but the way the ship's systems seemed to be failing for no apparent reason. The readings on the console flickered erratically, the sensors cutting in and out, and there was a faint hum beneath his feet, like something was thrumming deep within the ship, in time with his heartbeat. "We're getting some strange interference," said Dr. Arden, the team's lead scientist, her voice crackling through the comms. It's almost like something is trying to block our signals." "Keep an eye on it," Hale responded, his voice terse. "We're committed now. We land, get what we need, and get out. No heroics." The rest of the crew was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. They had all heard the stories, the rumors of ships that ventured too far into the uncharted regions of space, chasing after strange signals that seemed to call out to them, only to disappear without a trace. But this signal had been different, stronger, more persistent. It had been repeating for months, growing louder, more urgent, as if it was drawing them in. The landing was rougher than expected. The ship bucked and twisted as it punched through the dense, gray clouds that hung low over the planet, thick and suffocating like a shroud. When the Endeavour finally broke through, the sight that greeted them was unlike anything they had ever seen. A colossal structure rose up from the landscape, dwarfing the mountains around it. It was made of a black, glassy material, polished smooth and seamless, yet jagged and sharp, as if it had been carved out of the planet itself. It seemed to absorb the feeble light from the dying sun, swallowing it whole, casting no reflection. It stood like a dark sentinel, timeless and immovable, an ancient monolith that had been waiting for something, maybe them. What is that?" whispered Lieutenant Rourke, her voice barely audible. She had seen ruins on other worlds, remnants of civilizations long gone, but nothing like this, nothing that felt so wrong. Dr. Arden's eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, as she stared at the structure. "I don't know," she said, almost to herself. "It's not in any of the databases. Nothing like this has ever been catalogued. It's ancient." The ship touched down with a heavy thud, the landing gear sinking slightly into the soft, uneven ground. For a moment, everything was still. The team waited, listening to the hum of the engines as they powered down, the only sound in the oppressive silence that enveloped them. Then, with a hiss, the airlock doors opened and the crew stepped out, their boots crunching softly on the gravelly surface. The air was heavy, thick with a strange, acrid smell that stung their nostrils. It was cold, but not the kind of cold they were used to. This was a deeper chill, one that seemed to seep into their bones, gnawing at them from the inside. The sky was a dull, grayish green, swirling with clouds that moved too fast, shifting and twisting as if driven by some unseen force. Captain Hale led the way, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm, his eyes scanning the terrain around them. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if something was watching them, studying them. But there was nothing, just the silent, empty expanse of rock stretching out in all directions, and the towering structure that loomed over them, casting a long, dark shadow across the ground. As they approached, the scale of the structure became more apparent. It was massive, impossibly so, and there were no seams, no signs of construction. It was as if it had simply grown out of the planet, like a natural formation. The walls were covered in strange, intricate carvings, patterns that twisted and spiraled, interlocking in a way that hurt to look at for too long. Dr. Arden ran her gloved hand across the surface, feeling the grooves beneath her fingers. The carvings were deep, precise, and the patterns seemed to shift subtly, rearranging themselves when she looked away. "These markings, they're not just decorative," she said, her voice barely concealing a tremor of excitement. "They're a language, or maybe something else. I've never seen anything like it." "Can you read it?" Hale asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not yet," she replied, pulling out a small scanning device and starting to take readings. "But if we can get inside, I might be able to learn more. This could be the discovery of a lifetime." "Or our last mistake," Rourke muttered under her breath, her eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. They found the entrance on the far side, a pair of enormous doors, each at least 20 feet tall, made of a dark metallic material that felt unnaturally cold to the touch. There were no visible handles, no obvious mechanism for opening them, but as they approached, the air around the doors seemed to vibrate, a low, resonant hum that grew louder, almost like a warning. It took them over an hour to find a way to pry the doors open, using a combination of tools and sheer force. As they strained against the metal, there was a sudden, sharp crack, and the doors slid open, just enough for them to slip through. A gust of stale, frigid air rushed out, carrying with it a scent that made their eyes water and their stomachs churn. Something old, decayed, and foul. Inside it was dark, the kind of dark that swallowed light. Hale switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, revealing a vast, cavernous space that stretched out before them, the walls lined with more of the strange carvings, now glowing faintly in the darkness. "Everyone stay close," Hale said, his voice echoing off the walls. "We don't know what's in here." The corridor stretched endlessly before them, a narrow tunnel carved out of the dark, cold stone. The walls, slick and wet, seemed to shimmer under the dim glow of their flashlights, as if they were sweating. The strange carvings, the alien script that twisted and curled like tendrils, ran along every surface, emitting a faint, sickly green light that barely pushed back the shadows. The rhythmic pulse they had felt earlier was stronger here, a deep, resonant thrum that reverberated through the walls and into their bones. Captain Hale led the way, trying to keep his breathing steady. The air was thick and heavy, each breath like inhaling water. He glanced over his shoulder at the rest of the team, Dr. Arden, Lieutenant Rourke, and the others, watching their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. He could see the fear in their eyes, though no one dared to speak it. There was a feeling here, a sensation that crept into their minds, whispering that they were not supposed to be here, that they were trespassing in a place that was never meant to be found. As they moved deeper, the corridor began to open up, the walls curving outward to reveal a vast chamber. The team stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the massive, cavernous space that stretched out before them. The chamber was lined with dark, glass-like panels, each embedded into the stone, towering over them. The air here was colder, biting, and carried a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats. "What are these?" Rourke asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she approached one of the panels. It was dark, almost opaque, and her reflection seemed distorted, twisted, as if the glass were warping around her. Dr. Arden stepped closer, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and dread. She pressed her hand against the glass, and for a moment she thought she felt something. A slight vibration. A pulse. "Containment units," she said, her voice shaky. "I think these are cells." "Cells?" Hale repeated, his brow furrowing. "Cells for what?" Arden didn't answer, but as she looked closer, her flashlight picked out something behind the darkened glass. There, deep within the panel, she could make out a shape, a hulking, twisted mass, hunched and still, like an animal coiled in on itself. It was impossible to see clearly, but she could tell that whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't anything she had ever seen before. "I don't like this," muttered Rourke, stepping back from the glass. "Whatever they're keeping in there, we shouldn't be anywhere near it." "We have to keep moving," said Hale, though he could feel the unease gnawing at him, a sense of impending dread. "We need to find out what this place is, and why it was sending that signal." The team pressed on, moving deeper into the chamber, past rows and rows of the dark panels. Each one seemed to hold something different, a shadowy, indistinct figure that shifted and writhed just out of sight, as if trying to avoid the light. Some of the shapes were small, almost humanoid, while others were vast, amorphous things that pressed up against the glass, their forms stretching and bulging as if trying to escape. Hale could hear a faint scratching sound like nails on glass, echoing softly through the chamber. But when he looked around, there was nothing there. Then, as they rounded a corner, they saw it. The cell at the end of the row was different. The glass was clearer, and behind it, they could see a creature, massive, easily 3 times the size of a man, with limbs that were too long, too thin, ending in claws that scraped gently against the glass. Its body was covered in a dark, slick membrane, glistening in the faint light, and its head was featureless, smooth, save for a pair of sunken, hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at them, unblinking. It was still, but there was a tension in its posture, a sense of coiled energy, like it was waiting for something. "Jesus," Rourke breathed, taking a step back. "What the hell is that?" Dr. Arden was already scanning the panel, her hands trembling as she adjusted her equipment. "It's alive. It's in stasis, but it's still alive." Hale took a step closer, his breath fogging up the glass. He could see the creature's chest rise and fall, slow, rhythmic, like it was breathing. "Can you tell what it is?" he asked. "I don't know," Arden said, shaking her head, "but it's old. The readings are strange, like the cell is barely holding it. It shouldn't still be here." As she spoke, there was a sudden, loud crack, like ice splitting. The sound echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the walls, and the team froze. The creature behind the glass shifted, its head tilting slightly, as if it had heard something. The glass creaked, tiny fractures spiderwebbing across the surface, and Hale felt a chill run down his spine. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to Before he could finish, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, everything was plunged into darkness, and when the lights came back on, the creature was no longer still. It had moved, its face pressed up against the glass, its hollow eyes staring directly at Hale. The glass was cracked, thin lines radiating out from where its head touched the surface, and there was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor, as if the creature was trying to speak. Panic surged through the team, and Hale stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "Everyone, move! Back to the corridor, now!" They scrambled back, their footsteps echoing loudly as they ran, but the lights flickered again, and the chamber plunged into darkness once more. In the pitch black, they could hear it, the sound of something moving, slithering across the floor, the scraping of claws on metal. The pulse in the walls grew louder, faster, a rapid, frantic beat that seemed to sync with the pounding of their hearts. When the lights returned, the creature was no longer behind the glass. The cell was empty, the glass shattered, shards scattered across the floor, and the dark, slick trail of something wet and viscous led out of the cell and disappeared into the shadows. "Oh God," Rourke whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. "It's out." Hale scanned the room, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of movement. "We need to get back to the ship," he said, his voice firm, though he could hear the tremor in it. "Now." But as they turned to leave, the lights flickered one last time, and the shadows seemed to stretch, elongating, reaching out toward them. The pulse in the walls grew louder, more erratic, and in the dark they heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You shouldn't have come here." The team froze, every nerve on edge, as the voice echoed around them, impossibly clear yet distant, as if it was speaking from somewhere deep within the structure. Dr. Arden turned, her flashlight sweeping across the chamber, but there was nothing there, just the empty cells, the dark glass reflecting their terrified faces. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. "Who said that?" For a moment there was silence, and then from somewhere far below them they heard a sound, a deep, resonant thud, like a massive door slamming shut. The pulse in the walls stopped, and the air was still, heavy, oppressive. Then the voice came again, louder this time, echoing through the chamber, through the corridors, through their minds. "You've woken them up." And as the final word faded, the ground beneath them shuddered, and a distant, guttural roar rose up from the depths of the structure, shaking the walls, reverberating through the floor, a sound so deep and primal that it made their teeth ache. It was the sound of something waking up, something vast and ancient, something that had been asleep for a very, very long time. Hale's stomach twisted with fear as he realized what they had done. Whatever was in this place, whatever these creatures were, they weren't just prisoners. They were guardians, and something had disturbed them. Something was coming, and it was already too late to stop it. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Now." But as they turned to flee, the lights went out one final time, and the darkness swallowed them whole. The control room was a mess of decayed technology and rusted metal, tangled wires snaking across the floor like the veins of a rotting corpse. Monitors lined the walls, many of them dead and blank, while others flickered with static, casting erratic, pale light across the room. The air was thick, suffocating, carrying a stench that made them gag. An unpleasant mix of mildew, burnt circuitry, and something else, something old and rotten, like flesh left to decay in the dark. Dr. Arden was the first to enter, her flashlight cutting through the gloom, sweeping across the rows of consoles. The equipment was alien, built with a technology that looked ancient yet strangely advanced. She ran her fingers over a set of buttons, feeling the dust crumble beneath her gloves, and for a moment she could almost sense a rhythm, a pattern hidden beneath the chaos. "See if you can get anything online," said Captain Hale, his eyes scanning the room. "We need answers." Arden nodded, though her hands were trembling. She wasn't sure if it was the cold or the fear, perhaps both. She began fiddling with the controls, flipping switches, adjusting dials. For a few tense moments, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden click, one of the monitors sputtered to life, displaying a series of strange alien symbols that flashed across the screen, shifting and rearranging themselves, almost like they were alive. The team gathered around, watching as the symbols resolved into something resembling language. It was still gibberish to them, but then, slowly, the translation software they had brought along began to process the data, spitting out fragments of text, incomplete and garbled, but readable. Prison log number 3754. Containment breach detected. Critical failure imminent. Initiate lockdown protocols. Hale's heart sank as he read the words. Containment breach. That's what they had triggered. Whatever was held here, whatever nightmares lay dormant within these walls, were beginning to wake up. He glanced at Arden, who was furiously typing, trying to bring up more information. "This isn't just a building," she said, her voice a mix of awe and horror. "It's a facility, some kind of prison, I think." "No kidding," muttered Rourke, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "But what the hell were they keeping here?" "Something dangerous," Arden replied, still focused on the screen. "Something they couldn't let loose. Look at this." She pulled up a set of schematics, revealing a vast network of chambers, cells, and containment zones that stretched far below the surface of the planet. Each section was marked with a strange alien glyph, and next to some of them, there were brief descriptions that sent a chill down Hale's spine. Anomaly 7. Reality distortion. Anomaly 13. Spatial manipulation. Anomaly 22. Telepathic infiltration. The screen flickered again, and more text appeared, this time clearer, more coherent. It was a series of logs dated thousands of years ago, detailing the construction of the facility, the procedures used to capture and contain the entities, and finally, warnings. Dire, desperate warnings. Log number 5921. We have succeeded in containing the entities, but at great cost. Our technology barely holds, and the fail-safes are degrading. They are not just beings, they are forces, anomalies that defy the laws of our universe. If they escape, reality itself will bend to their will. Log number 6123. The Whisperer has begun to stir. We have reinforced its containment, but it is cunning. It has learned to speak through the minds of those nearby. We must remain vigilant. The Whisperer, Hale repeated softly. He remembered the voice they had heard, the voice that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. The words chilled him, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. It's one of them, isn't it? One of these things they've trapped here. Arden nodded slowly, her eyes wide with realization. It's not just one. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of them. And they aren't just physical beings. They're anomalies, creatures that shouldn't exist, that bend the laws of reality. Whatever civilization built this place, they captured these things and locked them away here, far from everything else, like sealing away a curse. But why? Why not destroy them? Asked Rourke, her voice trembling. If they're so dangerous, why keep them alive? The answer came not from Arden, but from the monitor itself. Another log, its text slowly appearing, almost as if the system was responding to Rourke's question. Log number 7132. We attempted to destroy them, but it was futile. They cannot be killed in any way we understand. They exist outside of life and death, outside of time. We could only contain them, and even that required sacrifices we are not proud of. If the seals fail, they will not die, they will escape, and they will spread. A cold silence settled over the room, and for a moment, no one spoke. Hale felt a weight pressing down on his chest, a deep, suffocating fear. He had thought they were exploring an abandoned structure, some ancient ruin left behind by a lost race. He had been wrong. This was a tomb, but not for the dead. It was a tomb built to imprison living gods. Dr. Arden pulled up one final file, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the controls. It was labeled simply, "The Purpose." The screen went black, and then a new set of images began to appear, accompanied by a voice, an alien voice, distorted and harsh, as if it was speaking across a vast distance, or from another time. The images showed a sprawling, impossible landscape, a world that was not their own, where the sky was a dark, churning sea of clouds, and the ground writhed with strange, twisted growths. And there, at the center of it all, was a massive, shimmering rift, a tear in reality, glowing with a cold, blue light. They came through the rift, the voice said, though it was not speaking in any language they could understand. Yet the words resonated in their minds, filling them with dread. They are not of this universe. They are echoes, shadows of something far greater, far older. We captured what we could, but there are more, always more. We built this facility to contain them, to seal the rift, to keep the echoes at bay. But we are failing. The seals are breaking. Soon, they will return. The image flickered, and for a brief moment the team saw something else. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, watching them. It was humanoid, but its form was indistinct, blurred, as if it was standing between two realities. Its eyes were bright, piercing, and full of an intelligence that felt wrong, as if it understood things that no living being should understand. Then the image vanished, leaving the team in the dark, with only the voice to guide them. The Whisperer speaks to you. It has seen you, and it knows your fears. You cannot escape it. You have awakened the echoes, and they are coming. You must reactivate the seals, or all will be lost. But be warned, they will try to stop you. They will make you see things, hear things, turn you against one another. You cannot trust your own mind. The screen went dark, and the room fell silent once more, save for the faint hum of the machinery. Hale felt his hands shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. Reactivate the seals? They didn't even know how to begin. And if these beings, these echoes, were capable of bending reality, of invading their minds, what chance did they have? We have to try, Arden said, her voice barely a whisper. If we don't, they'll get out. All of them. And if that happens... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The horror of what she was suggesting was clear enough. But how? Rourke demanded, her eyes wild. How do we reactivate something we don't understand? This place is falling apart. The power's failing, the systems are corrupted, and there are things we can't see, things that shouldn't exist, waiting for us out there. We do it because we have no other choice, Hale said, his voice hardening. If these things get out, they won't just destroy this planet. They'll spread like a virus, like a nightmare that infects everything it touches. We can't let that happen. As he spoke, there was a sudden, deep rumble, and the floor beneath them shook violently, sending them staggering. The monitors flickered, displaying brief, disjointed images, cells breaking open, shadows moving through the corridors, and the faint, distant sound of laughter, like a child's giggle carried on the wind. "They're waking up," Arden said, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to move. Now." And as the team turned to leave, the lights flickered one last time, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Hale saw something standing in the doorway. A tall, thin figure, its face smooth and featureless, its body draped in dark, flowing shadows. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly, as if listening, and then, without a sound, it melted back into the darkness, leaving only the echo of its presence, and a whisper that seemed to linger in the air long after it was gone. "You cannot stop us. You are already ours." And with that, the team ran, plunging headlong into the dark, with only the faint, distant hope of survival driving them forward, even as the whispers began to grow louder, echoing through the endless halls of the ancient prison, promising nothing but death and despair. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning, leading them deeper into the heart of the ancient prison. Every step was a struggle against the cold, suffocating darkness that clung to them, thicker than the air they breathed. The once dim, pulsing light that lined the walls had grown erratic, flickering wildly, casting jagged, dancing shadows across their path. Captain Hale led the way, his flashlight barely piercing the gloom, his mind clouded by a fog of fear and exhaustion. The whispers were louder now, creeping into his thoughts, slipping through the cracks in his sanity. "This is where it ends," the voice had said, echoing through the cold metal of the control room. "You are already too late." They had no choice. They had to try to reactivate the seals, to keep the horrors they had woken from spilling out into the universe. But deep down, Hale felt a gnawing doubt, a sense of inevitable failure that twisted his insides. He could see it in the faces of his team, the blank, vacant stares, the way their eyes darted nervously to the shadows, as if expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. They had been down here for what felt like hours, days even, but the path ahead offered no clarity, no promise of escape. Only the same cold, twisting labyrinth, closing in around them like the jaws of a trap. "We're close," said Dr. Arden, though her voice was flat, devoid of the confidence it once held. She clutched her scanner like a lifeline, the device blinking erratically, struggling to find a signal. "The central core. It should be just ahead." "Should be?" Rourke muttered, her voice barely masking the panic that had been rising within her. "Or is this just another dead end?" Hale didn't respond. He could barely think past the whispers, past the low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with the pounding of his heart. They are watching. They are waiting. He shook his head, trying to push the words out, but they clung to his thoughts, as if something was reaching inside his mind, twisting his fear into something palpable, something real. The passage widened, opening up into a vast chamber that seemed to swallow their light. It was massive, stretching out into the dark, with high arched ceilings lined with more of the strange glowing carvings. In the center stood a colossal machine, a monolithic structure of twisted metal and dark, glossy stone, covered in alien symbols that pulsed softly, almost like a heartbeat. Wires and conduits snaked out from the machine, stretching across the floor and vanishing into the walls, feeding into the very structure of the prison. Hale stepped forward, his boots echoing across the cold metal, and felt a sense of dread wash over him, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. There was a hum, low and deep, emanating from the machine, vibrating through his bones. He recognized it from the control room, the same rhythmic thrum that had haunted them since they first set foot inside this place. "This is it," said Arden, her voice barely a whisper. "The core. This is what controls the seals." "Then let's finish this," Hale said, though his words felt hollow, as if he was speaking from far away. He moved to the console, hands trembling as he began to flip switches, adjust dials, trying to make sense of the alien technology. The symbols on the screen shifted, rearranging themselves into patterns that made his head ache. But he kept going, driven by a desperate hope that this would be enough, that they could still make it out alive. As Arden joined him, their fingers flew across the controls, trying to follow the instructions left behind by the ancient race that had built this place. The room grew colder, the air heavy with tension, as if the entire prison was holding its breath. The lights flickered, and for a moment, Hale thought he saw something move in the corner of his vision, a dark, shapeless figure hovering just at the edge of the shadows, watching them. Rourke stood by the entrance, her rifle raised, scanning the room. She had barely slept, barely eaten, and her hands shook as she gripped the weapon. She could feel it too, that suffocating sense of dread, the whispers crawling up her spine, burrowing into her mind. "You can't stop us. You are nothing. You are already lost." Come on, Hale muttered under his breath as he worked, sweat dripping down his face. The machine began to respond, the symbols glowing brighter, the hum growing louder. For a moment he allowed himself to hope, to believe that they could still escape, that they could seal this place shut and leave these nightmares behind. Then the ground shook, a violent tremor that knocked them off their feet, and a deafening roar filled the chamber, a sound so deep, so primal, it felt like it was tearing through the very fabric of reality. The machine's lights flared, blindingly bright, and the air was filled with a shrill, discordant screech like metal being torn apart. "They're breaking through!" Arden screamed, scrambling to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. "The seals are failing. Everything's failing." Hale looked at the monitor, and his heart sank. The screen was flashing, displaying a warning in the alien script. Containment breach. Total failure. Initiate emergency protocol. The machine groaned, its lights flickering wildly, and Hale realized with a cold, sinking dread that it wasn't just failing, it was dying. The entire system was shutting down, and with it, the last hope of keeping the creatures locked away. From the darkness at the far end of the chamber, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, a ripple across the black, but then it emerged slowly, deliberately. A figure, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its body draped in a dark, flowing shroud. Its face was smooth, featureless, save for a pair of hollow, empty eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, gliding across the floor as if it was barely touching the ground. Rourke raised her rifle, but her hands were shaking too much to aim. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking. "Stay the hell back." The figure didn't stop. It moved closer, and as it did, more shapes began to appear around it. Dark, twisted forms that slithered and crawled, things that should not exist, things that defied any understanding of life or form. The air was filled with a low, guttural growl, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling their minds with a torrent of images. Worlds burning, stars collapsing, a black void that stretched out into eternity. Hale stumbled back, his heart pounding as he watched the creatures emerge from the shadows, one by one, until the chamber was filled with them. They were everywhere, crawling across the walls, slithering along the floor, their eyes glowing in the dark, their mouths opening wide to reveal rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. The machine was still humming, still trying to reactivate, but it was failing, sputtering, dying. "Do something!" Rourke shouted, firing her rifle into the dark, the shots echoing through the chamber. But it was like shooting into a storm, ineffective, pointless. The bullets passed through the shadows, disappearing without a trace, as if swallowed by the dark. Arden was frantically typing, her eyes darting across the screen, trying to find a way, any way, to bring the machine back online. But it was no use. The system was corrupted beyond repair. She could feel the tears welling up, the despair rising in her chest, but she kept working, kept trying, even as the shadows closed in around them. And then the voice returned, louder than before, reverberating through the chamber, through their minds, echoing off the walls. "You were never meant to find this place. You have awakened what you cannot understand, what you cannot control. Now, there is no escape." Hale felt something cold wrap around his leg, and he looked down to see a dark, slimy tendril coiling up his ankle, pulling him toward the shadows. He kicked at it, trying to free himself, but it was too strong. The more he struggled, the tighter it held, dragging him closer until he could feel the cold breath of the creatures on his skin, hear their low, guttural whispers in his ear. "No," he gasped, fighting against the pull. We can stop this." "No," the voice replied, and for a moment Hale could almost see it, the thing speaking to him, a vast, shapeless mass, a void stretching out into the infinite dark, its eyes piercing through the shadows. "This is how it ends. This is how it always ends." The machine let out one final, sputtering groan, and then, with a loud, jarring click, it died. The lights went out, plunging the chamber into total darkness. For a moment there was silence, a stillness that felt eternal, as if time itself had stopped. And then the dark erupted, alive with movement, with sound, with a cacophony of screams and laughter, of voices calling out from the void, voices that echoed through the endless twisting corridors of the prison. Hale felt himself being pulled down, into the dark, into the cold, as the shadows swallowed him whole. And the last thing he heard was the voice, whispering, calm and cold, "You are ours now. You always were." And then there was nothing. The darkness consumed them, and the ancient prison, its seals broken, its wards shattered, began to unravel, its walls cracking, its foundations crumbling. Deep within, the rift began to open, a tear in reality, glowing with a cold blue light, spreading out across the chamber, devouring everything in its path. The last remnants of the ancient dying machine flickered, sputtered, and went silent. The whispers faded, replaced by the deep, resonant thrum of the rift, pulsing in time with the beat of a heart that was not theirs, a heart that belonged to something vast, something ancient, something that had been waiting for a very, very long time. And as the rift opened wide, a cold, blue light spilled out, consuming the chamber, consuming the prison, and spilling out into the endless dark void of space, carrying with it the echoes of the dead, the whispers of the forgotten, and the promise of something far, far worse.